Well, thank you very much for the invitation to give the talk. It's a great honor and wonderful to be involved with JNU again. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everybody. And a little overview of my talk before I dive in. The origins of this talk came from the need to write an introduction for the 10th anniversary of the Journal of Arabian Studies, which I founded with Gerd Nonneman. Gerd and I are both based in Doha. Gerd's at Georgetown University in Qatar, and I'm at the Qatar National Library. And for the 10th anniversary, we wanted to write just a brief overview of the field. And this brief overview eventually ballooned into a 50-page survey of the field of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies from the very beginning to the present day, mostly focusing, however, on its institutional development. The journals, the societies, the centers, the major research projects, and the degree programs, and so on, including the Gulf Studies program at JNU. This took about half a year to write and is about to come out next week. It'll be available on open access, thanks to an arrangement that Qatar National Library has with Routledge, which is that any academic based in Qatar who publishes with Routledge journals will have their article available free online. So we'll circulate the link to that next week when it's available, so you can all read this long survey. What I'll do is just give you some of the headlines from what we've found. So without further ado, the field of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies is actually something that nobody's really written on before, that is across the spectrum of social sciences and humanities. If you speak to a political scientist, they can tell you about the development of the field within political science, and archaeologists can do the same for his or her field. But nobody has looked at the entire field across the spectrum of the social sciences and humanities and looked at how all of these different disparate disciplines eventually coalesced into a recognizable academic field called Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies. So what I'll do is I'll give a quick overview of the no, not time for that. I'll cue you on that one. There's a few slides I have to show you. Now I'll first of all talk about the writing, the scholarship, the people who've been writing on the Arabian Peninsula briefly, and then I'll switch to the main focus, which is the institutional development of the field. So people have been writing, scholars that is, have been writing on the Arabian Peninsula for about 2,500 years, if not longer. One of the first major sort of serious studies, you could say, was Herodotus in the histories, in which he writes, I think is it book 3, he discusses the Arabian Peninsula. Although there were earlier works as well, in Acadia. But these were probably more akin to intelligence reports and so on. The development of writing in the field began in the area itself. And so there is a long history of mainly Arab scholars writing on the Arabian Peninsula, some within the context of the growing Islamic world, or in other related things about Islam, Islamic law. But specifically on the Arabian Peninsula itself, it's been mainly historians who've been writing, and there were not that many. There were a few here or there, but if you take a look at local historiography, it largely dates from the late 18th century. That's when we begin to see sort of what we would the foundational texts of modern Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies historiography by people from the Arabian Peninsula. Outside and globally, the first scientific studies, with what we would would consider being works written by subject matter experts, began in the 1600s with the Dutch East India Company. They began to write intelligence reports on Yemen and Oman, but these were unpublished. They were only published recently by William Flor, but for published works, again, it was the two Dutch East India Company employees who published sort of historical surveys of the Arabian Peninsula, not as a whole, but Yemen, one on Yemen and one on Oman in the 1710s and then the 1740s, was it? The first comprehensive scientific survey, or an attempt at a scientific survey of the Arabian Peninsula as a whole, was by Christian Niebuhr, who, although he was German, he was funded by the King of Denmark. And this took place in the 1760s and resulted in two major publications in German, which were subsequently translated into French and then later on into English. But the first proper, what we would call academic studies, that is by university professors based at universities or academic societies, foundations, academies, or museums or national libraries, began in the 1840s. So it's really from the mid-19th century that we begin to see the academic, university-affiliated publications on the Arabian Peninsula. And this began by Germans, beginning with a major work, major geographical survey of the Arabian Peninsula. And then through the 19th century, this was joined by a number of other scholars, again, mostly Germans and French scholars writing on the region. But they were constrained or confined to the humanities. This development continued until about the 1950s. In the 1960s, we see a change. There's a step change, and this growing community of scholars writing on the Arabian Peninsula are joined by social scientists. So up until the 50s, the field had been dominated by Arabists, archaeologists, linguists, historians, anthropologists, as well as geographers. But in the 1960s, they're joined by political scientists, economists, sociologists, and this community of social scientists begins to develop in the 60s and 70s. But these are rather separate communities. Now, it's only in 1969 that we begin to see interaction between these two communities and the crystallization of a global academic community that's concerned with the study of the Arabian Peninsula. And this takes the form of some societies and so on I'll talk about later, but keeping my focus on the scholars for the moment, it begins with the first international interdisciplinary conference on the Arabian Peninsula, which was held in 1969. And then from then on, we have a series of conferences almost every year, pretty much every year, through the 1970s, culminating in 1979 with three major international conferences, all of which are now annual major gatherings of scholars in both the humanities and social sciences. So it's really in the 1970s that we begin to see the formation of an international body of scholars, both in the Arabian Peninsula and overseas. Major centers for development during this time, once we see the social scientists arrive on the scene, are Europe, primarily the UK, France, Germany, and then in Asia, it's primarily New Delhi, JNU being one of the founding institutions for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies in Asia, outside of the Gulf region and the Arabian Peninsula itself. Then something else I'd like to mention that the article discusses is we have, up until the 1970s, scholarship and work on the Arabian Peninsula as a whole was considered a fringe field within Middle East studies. So very few people worked on it. If you were a specialist on the Arabian Peninsula and you were on the job market, for example, in the 70s or even up until the 90s, it was very difficult to get hired because most departments were looking for specialists in the main areas of the Middle East. That is Turkey, Iran, Palestine, Israel, Egypt, the Mediterranean, Middle East, that sort of thing. So the Arabian Peninsula was considered not of much importance in the broad scheme of things within Middle East studies. But this began to change in the 1970s, beginning with Yemeni studies. So if I could have the first figure 1, which shows the chart of Yemeni studies. So this is an attempt to sort of give you some indication of the boom in Yemeni studies. So it begins in the humanities in the 1970s, as you can see. This is just an indicator. So this is just books in English in the humanities and social sciences. So there'd be a comparable graph, I would think, in all other languages, in Arabic, for example, in French, in German, and so on. So as you can see, it's really in the 1970s that things get rolling. Now, the reason for the boom in Yemeni studies is that Yemen itself, beginning with, I think, North Yemen and Sana'a, began to be open to international scholars. And it became easier to get a visa to go there and to do field work and to work on the area. It was also, for PhD students, very affordable. Like people working on other parts of the Middle East, for example, like Egypt, very affordable to fly there. Accommodation is very affordable. Food is very affordable. Transportation is very affordable. So a lot of people started to work on Yemen. It began in the humanities and social sciences, primarily in anthropology, and then later on in history, and then it expanded to the social sciences. And this state of affairs continued until the beginning of the Civil War in late 2014, when we begin to see again a tapering off of studies based on field work there because of the inaccessibility of the country, sadly, because of the instability in the ongoing civil war. However, Yemeni studies left the rest of the Arabian Peninsula in its wake. The rest of the Arabian Peninsula, the GCC states, still remain fringe within Middle Eastern studies. Things don't begin to pick up there. If we could switch to figure 2. Now, this is an indicator. It was too much to do all of the GCC states. So we, in this case, looked at Qatar, which is the least written about country in the Middle East. And if we take a look again at books in the humanities and social sciences, just in English as an indicator, you can see that things begin to pick up in the 2000s, and notably in the 2010s. So it's really in the 21st century that Gulf studies begins to see a boom in the number of works coming out, the number of articles, and in particular, the number of panels organized at the annual Middle East Studies Association conference in the US. Now, in the 20th century, if you went to MESA, you would typically see maybe 1, maybe 2 panels on the Gulf, and that was it. The most recent MESA conference held in November last year, or was it October, saw 10 panels on the Gulf region. So, and by the Gulf, I mean Eastern Arabia. So you can see that there's finally Gulf studies, GCC studies, has reached critical mass, has now gone mainstream. Now, why? There's a number of reasons for this. One, increasing interest in the region because the GCC states are taking, because of their economic power, are taking a greater role within the Middle East, becoming more involved in affairs. As you know, their involvement in Syria, in Libya, Egypt, and also in their engagement with Asia. The Gulf looks east policy began in about 2000. And so you see the GCC states become global players in the 21st century. And so naturally, there's more interest in writing on the region. Locally, we also see that it becomes easier for scholars to come to the GCC states and to conduct research. Up until the late 1990s, it was extremely difficult for scholars such as myself when I was doing my PhD to come here. First of all, if you were a political scientist, good luck getting a visa. Because if the government knew what you were looking into, they probably wouldn't give you a visa to come here. The high cost of living and the scarcity of research funding to come here was another obstacle. But then we begin to see the establishment of American affiliated or American satellite universities here in the Gulf, beginning with the American University of Sharjah, which was founded in 1997. Then we have the American University of Kuwait, 2003. Then Georgetown University is founded in 2005. And then, of course, the New York University in Abu Dhabi in 2010. Now, this is a game changer for a number of reasons. One, it makes it easier for scholars outside of the region to come to the region and to work on the Gulf itself. They have an affiliation. They usually can stay on campus and that sort of thing. It also creates changes the environment, the academic environment within the GCC states, because those people working at these universities or affiliated with them had academic freedom to a large extent. They could write on what they wanted. They were protected, which was not the case at the state universities. So before this time, beginning again in the 1960s, the GCC states began to found universities. Saudi Arabia was, I think, the first in the late 50s. So the governments began to send its citizens overseas to obtain PhDs, including in Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies. However, scholars could only write on approved subjects. And once they returned to their home, to Kuwait or Bahrain, for example, and they were given a government job in the universities, but these were primarily teaching universities. Teaching loads were high, 4 courses a term. There was no time for research, and there was also a concern that if they did publish anything that contradicted the national narrative, they might get into trouble, they might lose their job. So as a result, most PhD graduates from the GCC states themselves did not publish their PhDs. This state of affairs then changes once we have the opening of the satellite campuses and the American affiliated campuses. We see a growing sort of academic freedom. More people begin to publish. This has a knock-on effect for the state universities, the National University of, for example, Kuwait University, University of Bahrain, UAE University, etc. And so these academics are beginning to receive more time for research. Teaching loads are reduced a bit. And we begin to see the publications, by GCC citizens themselves in international peer-reviewed journals and so on. Not only obviously in Arabic, but also in English or in French. So this is sort of the state of affairs up until the present day, except that with the arrival of the Arab Spring in 2011, we see a return to the old restrictions. Mostly for the social sciences, where governments are wary of anybody who's going to write critically, even if truthfully, about current affairs. And so we begin to see clamping down. We begin to see censorship. In extreme cases, we see the arrest or deportation of academics, or simply the refusal to grant them visas. But despite this, academic scholarship continues on the region, and every year more and more is published than previous years. So there's thanks also to the internet, thanks, for example, to things for historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, so on, to things like the Qatar Digital Library, which I'm responsible for finding new content for. It's the largest digital archive on the Middle East, and now you can do historical research on the region from the comfort of your own home, wherever you are. All you need is a laptop and an internet connection. But the Qatar Digital Library is not the only digital library or digital archive on the Gulf region and on the wider Arabian Peninsula. There are several now, and so it's becoming easier and easier to conduct research on the region. And so the boom in scholarship on the Arabian Peninsula continues. Now I'd like to turn to discuss the institutional development of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies. So we could get rid of that slide. So the institutional development of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies developed out of archaeology. It began with something called the American Foundation for the Study of Man, which was formed in 1949 by an amateur archaeologist called Wendell Phillips, who was an oil concession seeker. He attempted to get and got oil concessions from many governments around the Middle East. And with this money that he obtained, he pursued his amateur interest in archaeology and sent the first major archaeological expedition to the Arabian Peninsula in 1950 to Yemen, to North Yemen. He gathered together a large team of professional archaeologists, all American, based at American universities. Through the 1950s, they then also examined South Yemen, and then later on Oman. Now, why is this significant? Because they then advertised this. There was a great amount of publicity around this. It's believed that Wendell Phillips was basically the template for Indiana Jones. So Indiana Jones was really based on Wendell Phillips. He was the Indiana Jones in the real world, but he focused on the Arabian Peninsula. This popularized the study of the Arabian Peninsula with the general public, but also he established the first publication series on the Arabian Peninsula. And they published a series of books with the American Foundation for the Study of Arabia books series. And so this rapid publication popularized the study of the Arabian Peninsula with archaeologists around the world who previously had largely ignored the Arabian Peninsula. So this has a knock-on effect. Within a few years, by 1953, in Denmark, two notable, who had become notable archaeologists, P.V. Slot and Jeffrey Bibby, then put together an archaeological expedition to Bahrain. And they very soon then expand their activities to encompass the entirety of Eastern Arabia, from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, all the way down to the Emirates and Oman, and also Qatar. And this expedition continued until the mid-1970s. And their publication of scholarship really sort of developed Gulf studies within the field of archaeology. And its related fields. So then Arabists began to be included. So this expedition included anthropologists, a musicologist, and later historians. And so a major conference was held in the early 1970s in Bahrain, the third international, I think, conference on archaeology. And it was devoted primarily to the archaeological finds of the Danish expedition up until that point. So this got a tremendous amount of coverage and also resulted in an intense amount of interest in the history and heritage of the Gulf states by the Gulf governments themselves. And so the important impact of these two archaeological expeditions is not just in creating and generating more academic interest in the study of the area, primarily in its history and heritage, but also by the Gulf governments themselves in funding that work. And so the institutional development of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies begins in the Gulf, starting with Abu Dhabi. The government of Abu Dhabi founds a major research center, the Center for Documentation and Research, which later became the National Archive of the UAE. And this is founded by a Emirati historian, one of the newly graduated Gulf citizens with a PhD in history. And this is soon followed later on in Saudi Arabia by the foundation of a similar institution. Where is it? The King Abdulaziz Foundation for Research and Archives in 1972. And then we have there's a in the article, there's a chronology in the appendix showing you all the foundation dates of all these different centers. Throughout the 1970s, then, we begin to see all of the first centers being established. This was followed soon after by for Arab Gulf Studies at the University of Basra, and then the Documentation and Research Department at the Amiri Diwan here in Qatar in 1974. Then the Yemeni Center for Cultural Research, Archaeology, and Museums in Aden in 1976. And then in 1978, we begin to see the first graduate program, master's and PhD program, with the foundation of the Gulf Studies program at the Center for West Asian Studies at JNU in 1978. The same year, we also see the foundation of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies in Sana'a. So by the late 1970s, Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies had reached critical mass within academia. And we have key institutions. In 1979, we have the foundation of the Center for Gulf Arab Studies at the University of Exeter, which I later became director of. And it founds an annual conference that is still ongoing. And so by 1979, we have not one, but 3 global international annual conferences involving the humanities and social sciences on the Arabian Peninsula. In parallel with this, we're also seeing a growth in scholarship of major collaborative works of scholarship encompassing both the humanities and the social sciences. Within Gulf Studies, the first one was this pioneering book, if you can see it, The Persian Gulf States, a General Survey by Alvin Cottrell, and many others that were to follow. So by the 1980s, we have too many scholars working on the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula study to mention, but the article mentions everybody up until about 1982. Right? Up until that point, you can mention who's who, but afterwards it's just too many. Now, throughout the 1980s, we begin to see an increasing number of institutions being founded, most of them government funded, starting again in the Gulf itself, but also internationally and globally. Now, alongside of this, we begin to see the foundation of an increasing number of publication series. The most notable one was 1974, was the foundation of this one, Arabian Studies, of which the Journal of Arabian Studies is the successor. This was founded at the University of Cambridge at the Middle East Center, and continued until the mid-1990s, in which point there was a generational handover from the founding editors, Robert Sargent and Robin Bidwell, to the Center for Gulf Arab Studies at the University of Exeter. And so we have the foundation of New Arabian Studies. And this continued on under the new editorial team that is the director of the Center for Gulf Studies and also an instructor of Arabic at the Department of Arabic at Exeter University, who had previously taught at Cambridge at the Middle East Studies Center, hence the link there. And then the journal, last publication was in 2004. I joined the Center for Gulf Studies at Exeter in 2005. And the first thing I wanted to do was to ensure that this journal would continue. However, the editors at that point had all decided to retire. So we entered into negotiations with them. That is Gerd Noneman, Dionysius Ajus, the other founding editor, and myself. And we wanted to continue the journal, but also to expand it to encompass the social sciences. Up until that point, Arabian Studies and New Arabian Studies was limited to the humanities. And the article explains why. It was primarily, we believe, because it was initially funded by the Emir of Bahrain, and then later funded by the ruler of Sharjah, Sheikh Sultan al-Qassami. And one of the, we imagine one of the conditions of that was that it would be a humanities-only journal, and that would leave out contemporary politics and so on. However, when we asked them if we could expand to include social sciences, they said, no, it's a humanities journal. So they decided to retire the journal, and we decided to found the Journal of Arabian Studies, which is follows in the footsteps of Arabian Studies, and likewise was the journal of the Center for Gulf Studies at Exeter University. Last year marked the 10th anniversary of the Journal of Arabian Studies, and so on that occasion we wrote this survey of the field. Now, another development in the field, and perhaps I'll stop here, is not only has Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies become mainstream within Middle East studies. You're seeing many more publications. You're seeing a lot more engagement with the Arabian Peninsula as part of the overall narrative about broader developments in the Middle East. But you're also seeing the incorporation of the Arabian Peninsula into Indian Ocean studies. Now, up until the 2000s, the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Arabian Peninsula had largely been excluded from considerations of its connections with the Indian Ocean. And the two fields sort of operated in isolation from each other. But beginning in the 2000s, starting with a number of books, but including my own first book, my PhD, the Arabian Frontier of the British Raj, it looked at the Arabian Peninsula in the context of the wider Indian Ocean. And so now I think that you could say that Arabian Peninsula studies and Gulf studies has been extensively incorporated into Indian Ocean studies. We're seeing the Gulf included in Indian Ocean studies conferences as a regular feature. And we ourselves are publishing articles that look at the Arabian Peninsula in the context of the Indian Ocean. But also, if you take a look at MESA, Indian Ocean is now being included as a subject for panels. And the August issue of the International Journal for Middle Eastern Studies, the leading journal in Middle Eastern Studies, has on its cover, if we can switch to figure 3. There we go. So this is the August issue of IDSA. And as you can see, we have on the cover a Gulf dhow. So that flag is the flag that was flown by Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Al Quwain. The photograph is of a Gulf dhow off the coast of Kenya. And it's the photograph for the lead article by Fahad Bishara at Virginia University, whose article looks at Middle East studies, or I should say Arabian Peninsula studies, not within the context of Middle Eastern studies, but within the context of Indian Ocean studies, and argues for a greater integration of the debates between Indian Ocean studies and Middle Eastern studies as a whole, looking at the broader connections and patterns and overlaps. And so we can see now that Gulf and Arabian Peninsula studies has been transformed in two major ways. It's both mainstream within Middle Eastern studies, and it has now become integrated into Indian Ocean studies. And so the field now is, I think, no longer a fringe field in these two fields of Middle East studies and Indian Ocean studies. It's now thoroughly engaged with them. And the number of publications that come out every year, as shown by these previous graphs, show that it is no longer an area of little interest, but is one of global interest. So I think I will leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. The fuller article we'll make available to you once it's published next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Onley. I think